we need to step back and understand larger strategic interests, at least interests that may or may not be real for the American people, but are being driven in Washington by interests. The largest, most powerful scientific industrial state in terms of output, production, growth, all of those matters by any measure in Europe and in much of the world, frankly, certainly it's in the top 3 or 4, is Germany. Historically, there has been peace in Europe and cooperation whenever Moscow and Berlin have cooperated. And that goes back over 300 years. And I think the Anglo-Saxon powers, Great Britain, primarily the British Empire, and then the United States, and now both Washington and London, have decided that whatever happens in the future, that level of cooperation and collaboration should never happen again. And so there is this underlying notion, not just that the Germans were benefiting from cheap natural gas in their manufacturing and industrial facilities, because they were. Right now, the German chemical industry, which is the leader in the world, optics, leader in the world, some of your more advanced medicines, leaders in the world. We haven't even gotten into steel and other areas of technology and engineering that the Germans lead in. All of those things are shutting down. Tens of thousands of Germans are out of work. So in addition to being unable to heat your home, you're no longer able to make a living, and the economy itself is being destroyed. Now, when this became clear to even someone as disappointing and unimaginative as Olaf Scholz, the accountant who became prime minister, he decided that it was time for secret talks with Moscow to find a way out of this, because he recognized that Germany was in serious, serious trouble economically and, most important, socially. Go back to what I was discussing earlier. You know, all the problems in a society that are suppressed and held in check by various forces suddenly come to the surface when the state turns out to be feckless and incapable. That's happening in Germany. So they're talking about social unrest on a scale no one has seen since 1929, 30, and 31. Unsurprisingly, we found out about these talks. And there is a theory, and I cannot prove it, and I have no facts to support it other than my knowledge of these talks and interests, that we decided to act, whether we did it or the United Kingdom's Royal Navy did it, or the Poles did it with assistance from the Royal Navy or from us. I have no idea. But suddenly we had this detonation and put this pipeline out of business, which essentially foreclosed German options and said, whether you like it or not, Germany, you are a vassal state of the greater American empire. You will do as you are told. You will stand fast and hold the line as we pursue this fight with Russia. Now, here's a piece of news I just received, and I don't know if this is right or not, but I received a tweet from Germany this morning indicating that someone in the German government, I don't know who it was, has said that the Nord Stream pipeline that was damaged can be repaired. And if that's true, I'm sure the Danes, the Germans, Dutch, and others will all be interested in repairing it. The other little piece of information that Americans are not aware of is that very suddenly, within 24 hours of the destruction of Nord Stream 2, you had in Poland a pipeline that had been built between Norway and Poland to carry natural gas suddenly begin to operate and provide, by the way, much more expensive natural gas than the Russians to the Poles. And at the same time, the Poles, out of the blue, decided that they want trillions of dollars of reparations from the Germans. And this is decades after these issues were settled by Germany in the 1960s and 70s with all of the states that were injured by the German military during World War II. So it's very odd to see this strange convergence of various activities right in the aftermath of this Nord Stream 2 destruction. In any case, it's a disaster for Germany. It's a disaster for Central Europe. And this disaster is having an impact elsewhere. Things are very bad in the United Kingdom. And the Norwegians have already told the British that if they're short energy this winter, that Norway may not be able to help them. because Norway has its own needs as well as its paying customers elsewhere. What we're finding is that all of the European states that have lived together in relative peace and harmony for 50, 60, 70 years, they're not so harmonious. And they are out for themselves. And no one gives a damn if something is what they desperately need and someone else has it. So that's why I say I think this entire superstructure of the EU and NATO is likely to first fragment, splinter, and then either fall apart officially or just sit a collection of empty buildings in Belgium somewhere.
Well, what you're saying is very plausible, because if Russia and Germany are looking for an off-ramp, blowing up the pipeline takes away Russia's most compelling incentive to Germany, which is, resuming the supply of cheap natural gas. But in terms of your claim that there were secret talks between Germany and Russia toward this end, this is something you've heard from your own sources, or this has been reported?
No, I've read that in open source in German newspapers as well as here. You can find that in the media. It's very difficult, but you can dig it out. And I think it's entirely plausible. And remember, both Macron and Scholz were talking off and on to Putin. And I think that's another reason that Putin was not putting his foot on the gas with regard to military power, because he thought, well, perhaps Macron and Scholz are actually going to sober up. They're going to take the lead and we'll put an end to this conflict. Again, he was disappointed.
What is it that the United States and the West wants to achieve? Like we keep hearing talk of weakening Russia, making it so that they can't do something like this again. But I don't think that they're being motivated by humanitarian concerns. I don't think that they care about saving the lives of Ukrainians, or else they would be probably engaging in or encouraging diplomacy and negotiations. Mm-hmm. So what are their actual motives? Why do they care about weakening Russia? Another easy question for you.
Dimitri Simes asked the same question on Monday. And you have to set aside rationality. Because once again, if you look at it from a purely strategic interest standpoint, we have no interest ultimately in who controls Eastern Ukraine. I mean, let's be frank. It doesn't make a great deal of difference to us. What we do have an interest in Eastern Europe, as well as in the rest of Europe, is avoiding a war. And that has been part of American national military strategy since Eisenhower was in office. Whatever happens, we must work hard to avoid a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union. And subsequently, after the collapse, even President Bush, said we no longer regard Russia as an enemy, but we have a permanent interest in peace in Europe. Well, of course we do, because at the end of the day, prosperity depends on order and peace. You can't have prosperity without it. And we have always been preeminently interested as a commercial power in prosperity. So logically, none of this makes any sense. So I have to set that aside.
Let me ask you about this news from OPEC, where they just announced that they're going to slash oil production by 2 million barrels per day. The fear now is that this will push up oil prices worldwide. And the Biden White House sees this both as obviously a big threat to their own political prospects in the midterm, but also helping Russia in the proxy war in Ukraine. This is just happening as we're speaking, so you might not have had the time to look at this news, but I'm wondering, just hearing this now, if you have any reaction to it and what this means for the proxy war going forward.
Well, I think it's very important because for a very long time, as we talked about earlier, people were tired of being bullied by the United States, not just with military power, but through the global financial system that we control and dominate. In other words, the dollar-based system of commerce and exchange. People have been looking for an alternative, but this financial system that we've built is both very effective. It's extremely beneficial to us. It's not easy to replace. And this serious effort to now replace it has begun. So you have many countries that are interested in quote unquote de-dollarizing, and that includes the Saudis. I think it's spreading to the Emirates. India certainly is part of that. So is China. Frankly, the Japanese are uncomfortable with it. And one of the things that's happening that nobody ever bothers to point out, which I find very strange, is that the Japanese and the Chinese are currently dumping their U.S. treasuries. that should be taken as a very serious matter, because the assumption is that people will always buy our debt, but that's no longer true. So the Fed has been buying up portions of our debt for a very long time. We're going to get to the point where no one wants to buy our debt. Then you're in trouble, because we can't finance ourselves. And since we have no manufacturing base, we don't build anything anymore or produce anything anymore other than some military equipment. How do we survive it? So I think all of these things are connected, and the Saudis have made it very clear that they are happy to do business with the Russians in rubles, with the Chinese in yuan. And remember, it was the petrodollar that succeeded the gold standard dollar that went out of business under Nixon. If the petrodollar goes under, what have we got left? Now, I'm not saying all of this happens immediately, but I think it's closer than we think. And I think we're going to see more and more alternatives to the current global financial system and its institutions emerge. And I think the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians in particular, the Brazilians, and many others around the world are cooperating right now to achieve that end. And that's something that should concern us. So I think it's a very dangerous set of circumstances emerging. I don't think we're in control anymore, Aaron. I don't think the Bush administration is in control at all.
Biden, yeah.
And I think most Americans are figuring it out. So pretty soon, people are going to say, well, who's in charge? Who's in control? How does this happen? We underestimated the Russians based on the first few weeks, because the Russians deliberately went in there in pursuit of a very different set of goals and objectives than we imputed to them. All they were interested in was making the Minsk Accords actually work, to get Russians who were living in Ukraine equality before the law, and get the two breakaway republics the recognition they deserve as effectively Russian enclaves, and recognize the legitimacy of Russia's rule over Crimea. And then, neutrality for Ukraine, which I always felt would be a blessing. And indeed, I think it would be now, but unfortunately that didn't happen. Now, here we are a year later, and the Russians have said, okay, you want to wage war, we're going to wage war. And they built a force to do that, but they also have to confront the reality that the weather has to cooperate. And it took them until December to really get this force in place and trained. And when January came, they didn't get the level of freezing that they wanted that would support maneuver. And so they reverted to long-range attack and incremental moves in the south to consolidate control over the Donbass. When Bakhmut falls, and the towns to their east of Bakhmut fall, that effectively is the end of the battle for the Donbass, which is what everybody wants, because it's the income-producing area. So once that's over, and you get a dry season finally, and get past this muddy season, which is horrendous, then I think the movement begins. And how far will that go? Well, you just said something that's very important. If you're sitting in Moscow and you're hearing people say, we will stay with this to the bitter end, our goal is to fatally weaken Russia, to drive out Putin, to potentially even dismember the state. And failing that, we're going to launch an Afghanistan-style insurgency. You hear this from Moscow, or you're sitting in Moscow, you hear this. The only conclusion that you can reach is that I have to end this war. And the only way I can end it is to march several 100,000 Russian troops all the way to the Polish border. That's the problem.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And, war is a government program. And so, the self-licking ice cream cone and all that. I mean, and in fact, I think we talked about this a year ago, that if the Russians succeed in taking the East, well, now what? Now they've left an enemy rump state dominated by the hardest right-wing Ukrainian nationalists in alliance with NATO and the Poles. That is going to be an even worse thorn in their side, or as an equal thorn in their side to the previous situation. So then they're just going to have to solve that problem. Then once they solve that problem, now they've just picked up 2 new NATO nations on their borders.
Well, that's right. And that's something they obviously wanted to avoid. But my supposition, and perhaps I'm wrong, but my supposition is that by the time they've closed on the Dnieper, the Europeans will say, that's enough. And they don't want this sort of unrelenting insurgent warfare in Western Ukraine under any circumstances. It's very difficult to wage it there, to be blunt, because other than the Carpathian Mountains that are in the far west, the rest of Western Ukraine is largely open, rolling countryside. So that's a tough place to run an insurgency. It ends up becoming simply a set of targets on a daily basis for Russian standoff attack weapons. But I think the Europeans will oppose that, because there's always the danger, if this drags on, how long before it starts spilling into Poland, Slovakia, Romania, Lithuania. And the Russians aren't interested in that. They don't want it to go on. The Europeans don't want it to go on. Of course, there's always the outside possibility that someone in Washington, D.C. wakes up and smells the coffee. Mm-hmm. I think that is possible, because now I'm beginning to detect this new groundswell to justify enormous defense spending by talking about the looming China threat. And you got to stop and ask yourself a question. If we're happy with what's happening in Ukraine, why are we now shifting the conversation to China?
Yeah.
And of course, the Chinese are many things, but they're certainly not a military threat in the way that they're being described, and far from it. I don't see any evidence for any Chinese interest in attacking the United States. I don't see any interest in the Chinese attacking Taiwan. In fact, we know that the Taiwan government and Beijing are constantly talking to each other on back channels. It's not going to be a war there. So why are we talking about suddenly China again? I think they're trying to change the subject in anticipation of everything falling apart in Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I would hate for them to hawk it up against China, full stop, even if it's an excuse to change the subject from Ukraine. But I'll take it. Sort of the way they finally shut up about COVID when the Ukraine thing broke out. Well, at least they shut up about COVID. So I don't know. And let's get back to China in a minute, because I'm interested in your takes on that. It's really important stuff. But on the question of the presumed sooner or later medium-term future here loss of the Ukrainian military, and then the choice being either, we discussed the possibility of an insurgency, and then as you're saying, the Russians will need to take the whole west of the country if we do them like that, and the Europeans are going to want to stop. What about the other option that you brought up a couple times now, which is what John Mearsheimer warned about last summer, which is that he thinks that Biden and his people are so committed to their rhetoric about making sure that this works that they will escalate. They'll use the U.S. Navy, they'll send in the Marines, they'll do something crazy and turn this into a real war between America and Russia. Now, I guess changing the subject to China is one way out of that, but do you think that is a real worry?
Well, I don't know what the Marines would do. They're pretty light, other than go if they were to enter the current theater of war, they'd be killed. They're not the U.S. Army. They don't have massive quantities of armor. In fact, the U.S. Army isn't the U.S. Army anymore. I think we'd be lucky to get 50,000 combat troops on the ground for any length of time out of this army of 450,000, 460,000. We just don't have that many people in the combat units with the right equipment. I don't think that happens. If you widen this to the use of the Navy, well, then surface vessels will be sunk in great quantities. The Russians rely heavily on their submarine fleet. And submarines are extremely difficult to deal with. We'd end up in some long and tiring exercise with our submarines attacking theirs or trying to find them. And then, of course, that would halt all transatlantic movement immediately. So that means you can't resupply anybody over there unless you use aircraft. And even then, I think that would be hazardous. The Russians may decide to shoot everything down that comes across the Atlantic. I'm not sure that's true. My own thinking is that they will try to change the subject as it becomes clear that this is a disaster. Yeah. What happened when Washington left Vietnam, which was clearly a disaster? Well, they stopped talking about it.
Right.
And the same thing happened when we left Afghanistan.
Yeah, and Iraq too.
Once the mainstream media stopped talking about it. When Ukraine is destroyed or in ruins, they probably won't say much about it. But I think NATO will split rather dramatically along many, many lines. There will be a push for talks with the Russians. It will have to be from new governments in places like Germany and Berlin. Russians aren't going to pay any attention to Scholz. And they certainly aren't going to pay attention to the Biden administration as long as it's around. So it'll have to be new governments in Europe. And then I think we'll just walk away and the focus will turn entirely to China, and which is crazy because, I hear people contact me and say, well, look at what the Chinese are doing to us with fentanyl. Well, the Chinese aren't doing anything to us with fentanyl. The Chinese are supplying the ingredients for fentanyl to the so-called drug cartels in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. They are in turn weaponizing those and sending them back into the United States. Well, if you want to stop that, there's a very straightforward solution. You secure your border. You secure your ports. You control immigration. Somebody told me recently over in DHS, Doug, 20,000 Russians entered the United States last year. Okay, where are they? What are they doing? I'm sure most of them are quite happy to be in the United States, but it would seem unlikely that out of that 20,000, there weren't several agents working for Moscow.
Well,
that
Doug,
doesn't even begin to address the thousands of Chinese that have been pouring into our country over those open borders. Where are they?
No,
what are they doing?
Don't worry. You can trust the FBI counterintelligence division. They're not too busy framing the last president for treason. They'll take care of that. Well, folks, sad to say, they lied us into war. All of them. World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq War I, Serbia, Afghanistan, Iraq War II, Libya, Syria, Yemen. All of them.
Yeah, that's right.
But, I got to point out, it's the comedian Eddie Griffin said this, that, it was all deliberate, but it doesn't have to be deliberate for the joke to still land that. This is all just turnabout's fair play anyway. America has helped to increase the opium supply in Eurasia by 1,000 trillion% over the last 20 years. And no doubt addicting and destroying the lives of however many Chinese in that time too. And so not that it's right or fair or even presuming that it's Chinese government policy or again, even that it's American government policy to deliberately do this, but it sure is the effect of what we've done in the Afghan war. But the whole world they're just supposed to sit there and take it. They're not allowed to resent us for stuff like that. But if the Chinese sell opium-based products to Mexican cartels, well, that's an act of war, I guess. And we need to, risk H-bomb conflict with this country over something like that, which is a purely ironic kind of reversal of America's role in the world anyway.
Well, I think China, as you point out, at the moment is a kind of an attractive scapegoat. Whatever's wrong, you blame it. What happened to our manufacturing base? Well, it went to China. Nobody points out the people that sent it to China started that process under Reagan. And it accelerated under Bush and Clinton and continued into this century. It had nothing to do with the Chinese. The Chinese simply offered space and people wanted to come in and they made lucrative arrangements and the rest is history. Our so-called ruling class, Scott, sold us out. But if you go to China, and, I've been to Northeast Asia, and you talk to Koreans, Chinese, the Japanese in some cases, but the Japanese aren't always willing to talk. But the Koreans and Chinese will, and the Chinese will point out to you very rapidly, well, the opium wars that were fought in the 1840s and 50s to open our ports so that opium could be forced into China. Mm-hmm. Well, that was the Royal Navy. Well, that's true. That was the Royal Navy from Great Britain. But you had lots of people who became millionaires and billionaires as a result of funding it. And one of those was Vanderbilt. Mm-hmm. So these people in Asia haven't forgotten any of that. And that's one of the reasons the South China Sea is a sore spot, because for centuries it became a lake of the Royal Navy. And the Chinese could do nothing to keep these things out of their ports. They had no control of their own borders. Mm-hmm. So, I guess all I'm saying is that I'm tired of people that want to wage war, as you point out, against China for things that really are largely our own fault, that we could correct most of those problems ourselves. Now, listen, if you don't want the Chinese in your laboratories, then don't let them in.
Yeah.
I mean, the Koreans and Japanese that I've done business with say, do you see any Chinese in our manufacturing facilities? Do you see any Chinese in our universities? Do you see any Chinese in our corporate laboratories? I said, no. They said, of course not. Why are you so stupid? The Chinese have been doing these things for thousands of years. They steal whatever they can find and send it back home. Okay, I get it. I understand it. Why won't we take action? Yeah. Well, Scott, you've pointed out over the years, and I think very accurately, that an awful lot of this is simply about money here in the United States. And the Defense Department has turned into this giant money machine. But clearly, China looks more and more like a scapegoat. And that's a war we don't need to fight, that doesn't need to happen, and can easily be avoided. But it compels us once again to look inward, to look at our own society, to look at our own government, to look what we are not doing here that we need to do to protect ourselves and to defend the American people. I mean, this word defense seems so out of place in the conduct of American military policy. Everything's about offense. I don't hear anything about defense. And quite frankly, we live in a very different world today from what existed 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. And we need to defend the country. Mm-hmm. That's different from intervening in the affairs of Eastern Ukraine in a war that we hope will destroy Russia. That's not really a very intelligent national policy, in my judgment.
Yeah. Well, it seems like when the neoconservatives really seized control of American policy after Iraq War I, I guess, in the aftermath of it, with the defense planning guidance and then, of course, PNAC and all of that stuff, that, Charles Krauthammer called it the unipolar moment. And they understood that now that the Soviet Union is out of the way, that we have this period of time, a generation, if we're lucky, to set the table on the planet exactly how we want it before, naturally, the rest of the world gets rich enough that their opinion will start to matter more. And so India and Brazil and China and Russia, again, eventually, they will have to have a seat at the table, and it will look more like a multipolar world. The whole contest was to see how well America can set the structure of the thing up by the time those nations rise up to fill their place. Now it's a generation later, 30 years later, but the Americans can't accept that what they thought was going to happen happened. The time went on and those other countries got richer and more powerful, and now their opinion matters a little bit. China's not taking over the world like they say on Fox News. It's just rising up to take its place at the table where America was taking up 6 of the 10 seats or whatever it is, if I'm making sloppy metaphors. But so the point is, though, that why can't they remember that it only ever was to be a unipolar moment, that this is just the middle part of North America, that we cannot, now, never mind may not, we cannot be the dominant power in Eurasia forever. It just can't work. It doesn't work.
Well, I don't disagree with you. Obviously, I think you're right. But the problem is the neocons in particular believe in this notion, I think, of perpetual revolution, and that America should be its instrument. And this is reminiscent of the Trotskyite Bolsheviks. Ultimately, Stalin dislodged them and expelled as many of them and killed as many of them as possible because they kept arguing for this internationalist position that would drag the Soviet Union into war with its neighbors. And his argument was, well, the first thing we need to do here in the Soviet Union is consolidate and build. We don't need war with the West or war with anyone. Right now, what we need to do is consolidate, our industries. We need to re-examine what we're doing. We need to develop new economic policies. We need real security for the United States and the Western Hemisphere. No one wants to go there because this is not part of the larger money machine. Well, that money machine needs to stop. And the only way to stop it, I'm afraid, is probably with some measure of bankruptcy. And I think our economic or financial system is about to tip over. That's going to have an impact. We're certainly back where we were in 2008, only much worse. These proverbial chickens will come home to roost, and there will probably be opportunity then to do some things differently and take care of business here at home. But I don't see any other force arresting it right now other than the economic reality that we confront. Do you?
No, sir. I mean, that's always been the contest for 20 years is can the economic catastrophe, the impending collapse of our phony economic system and monetary system save us from nuclear war? Ultimately, that's going to be the contest because, as Ron Paul said, no one will listen. It's just we're going to run out of money at some point. The question is whether we run out of money before the H-bombs start flying, because the Americans just can't stand the fact that Russia and China exist, and without Yeltsins to just do exactly as they're told. But it's a pretty big planet, you know. I don't know. I don't know how they think they could run China out of Washington, D.C. if they had a guy in there. You know what I mean? You'd probably just let them alone.
It's not a question of running them out. It's a question of doing business in a way that is profitable and mutually beneficial. And we haven't done that. We have too many greedy people with too many short-term interests. There's no long-term consideration, and there's an acute lack of devotion to the country. It's a huge problem, and it's not going to fix itself quickly. But I think the economic dimension is going to facilitate some change in the right direction. How we react to it is another matter.
Right.
But there are a lot of people in this country now, much more so than I remember at any time in the last 20 years, who seem to be angry and seem to be acutely sensitive to all of these things. We'll just have to see how it plays out politically. But right now, I think a lot of people have also discovered that these two parties don't really amount to much. That there has to be a third force, some new force in American politics, because the two parties are basically rooted in the same swamp, are they not?
Yeah. Well, and you know what, too, like Ron Paul says, that ultimately, even in the Soviet Union, the people get the government that they deserve and demand. And if people won't go along with it anymore, then it won't work. And it really is up to us. And even if we don't control exactly the levers of power, if we had a real consensus in this country among the hundreds of millions of us that we don't want to do this anymore, then they would have to stop. So,
well, that's true. And I think just to circle back a little bit to what's happening in Ukraine, today, the Russian population is overwhelmingly behind Vladimir Putin and his government. They are incensed at what we've tried to do to them in Ukraine, and they want blood. And we should be very grateful, ultimately, that Putin has exercised tremendous influence and restraint over these people. Because if the Russian populace was to have its way, Ukraine would probably go out of existence. They'd steamroller the place. That's how angry they are. And so you're right. Popular sentiment makes a difference. And it has made a huge difference in Russia. We need to be more sensitive to it than we are. But again, this is back to the original proposition. When you get chaos as a result of this coming economic downfall, we will find out who is going to step in and who is going to lead. And the population will have a chance to either support or reject what they don't want, because they'll be interested. They'll be interested because they want to eat. They'll be interested because they want to heat their homes. They'll be interested because they want to drive their cars.
Yeah.
If you get my drift. Yeah, I see no evidence that anyone at the top of the Defense Department, even though I think these are some of the least impressive people that we've had in the history of the United States, one thing I can say for them is that they very clearly don't want a war with Russia, and they absolutely have warned against the use of any nuclear weapon. I also think that Blinken understands the gravity of the situation when you involve nuclear weapons. Now, I can't vouch for the rest of the bunch. I don't know who calls the shots, Susan Rice, Samantha Powers, whoever. I don't know what they think. I don't know what the neocons that they're listening to think, per se. But at least in those two instances, there's an understanding that what you just described is the ultimate nightmare, and it's one that we absolutely want to avoid.
Yeah.
And we need to end this war, make whatever territorial arrangements are necessary, and move on. I don't know. I hope so.